Okay, so today's tutorial is all about making sweet wrapper pouches, but we can make them out of other things as well. So I've got this crisp packet here, this multi-pack, and I've got that double-sided. You can use any kind of packaging around the house. All you need to think about is the design on that packaging and making sure that when you're preparing the packaging, you don't cut too small so that you're going to lose some of that design when you make your pouch up. So here, for example, on this lolly wrapper, the word swizzles at the top. We've just managed to keep that word, but sometimes the packaging, the words just go all the way across the packaging and it's a bit tricky. So go and find your packaging, just take a look at it and make sure that if you lose all your seam allowances around the sides and top and bottom, that it's not going to ruin the overall effect. And then I will show you how to make your very own sweet wrapper pouch. So when preparing your wrapper, you're going to cut the front and the back so that they are independent pieces like this. And the back's nearly always got a join going through it, so it might end up a little bit more wrinkly than the front. If you've got little rips like I've got here, don't worry too much, because with a bit of clever placement, when you put your Lamifix on top, or of course whichever iron-on vinyl you're using, you can catch that underneath and you will actually iron it all together and it won't really show too much. So you're going to have your sweet wrapper at the bottom and then your vinyl on top. This particular brand doesn't have anything sticky on the back. Some of the other brands do have a little bit of a light adhesive on the back, which can help or hinder in terms of actually placing your iron-on vinyl in place before you iron. And then with that on top and a piece of greaseproof paper on top of that, you're going to iron over it until you've completely attached your wrapper and your iron-on vinyl. So it's going to look something like this or something like this. You'll note on these two examples I've only cut one part of the wrapper open. Sometimes it's easier to do that for the next stages, but sometimes if you're being a bit more frugal with your iron-on vinyl, you want to cut your sweet wrapper down to whatever size, as small as possible, so that you can use up your offcuts. What you do need to remember when you are cutting down your sweet wrapper is that you are going to lose all the way around it to seam allowances. So don't worry about the fact that you can only see half the flake up there, the word flake, and a little bit of the 9 bars, because some of this is going to get lost at the top. And the beauty of these is that they are an actual sweet wrapper, so it's not necessarily going to be perfect placement. Just to show you how else you can use the vinyl, so you can also iron it onto your favourite cotton so that you've actually got some laminated cotton to work with to make something waterproof. So hopefully you can see just here, there's an area that's got the Lamifix, the iron-on vinyl on it, and there's an area that hasn't. And I could actually now make myself a nice wash bag out of that, or anything that I wanted to be waterproof. So the iron-on vinyl is really good for being able to make your own kind of laminated waterproof cottons. And you can iron it just to the outside and then do something else with the inside, but there's no reason why you couldn't iron it to both sides of your fabric. Perhaps if you were making a wash bag and didn't wish to line it, you could just laminate both sides of the outside fabric. So the iron-on vinyl is really quite a useful thing to have. I just really like its application. I like the texture and the feel of it when it's been laminated. Anyway, let's get back to the project in hand and our sweet wrapper pouches. Okay, so we've ironed our Lamifix onto our sweet wrapper, and then I've actually trimmed this chocolate wrapper down into 2 smaller pieces. But as I say, if you wanted to, you could use it as one large piece and then trim after the next stage. As it is, it's quite stable, you could work with it, but I like to line my pouches. So what I'm actually going to do is give a little bit more strength to my laminated sweet wrapper by quilting it onto another layer of fabric, or just stitching it on. So you can use anything you like really. I've got here an offcut of brushed cotton, so like a piece of flannel, and that's going to be about the right size. So I'm going to trim my flannel so that it's just a little bit bigger than my sweet wrapper, like so. And then I'm going to pin my sweet wrapper onto my flannel. Now, every time you put a hole into the wrapper, it's going to stay a hole, and you're creating a hole that's going to stay there forever. So when you're getting to this stage, what you want to do is ensure that you've got a little bit of the Lamifix still hanging over, so don't trim it off too much at this stage. And then you're just going to pin through the clear vinyl at the ends where the wrapper isn't. And then that's just going to hold that in place for us so that we can stitch it and just attach it to the piece of flannel underneath. And that's just going to make it a little more structure basically, and a bit stronger. So when you're preparing your Lamifix or whatever vinyl you're using to go on top of your sweet wrapper, make sure that you do have excess hanging over the edges. The nice thing about it is it doesn't really spoil your ironing board when you're doing it, so but you could obviously put a layer of greaseproof paper underneath. So with my sweet wrapper now pinned to my piece of flannel, I'm now going to run some stitches through it. And what I'm looking to do is just lightly attach the sweet wrapper to the flannel. So here's one that I've already done, and you can see that I've done my lines of stitching. They're not regular by any means, and they don't need to be. If you wanted them to be, they can. And I've done about 6 lines of stitching across that. Now, you don't need to go too close to the top edge or too close to the bottom edge, because that's going to be picked up by seams. You're just looking to put some stitching through your sweet wrapper. And remember, I said a moment ago about how every stitch is going to perforate your wrapper. So what you want to make sure at this stage is that you've chosen a really long stitch on your machine, so that you're not going to create lots of tiny perforations. So I've set my machine up to a 5 stitch length, but go to whatever's the maximum on your machine. And just make sure that it's feeding through really nicely. Because you're creating holes, you don't want to be unpicking, so just go with the flow. And don't worry too much if it doesn't look exactly as you wanted. It will look lovely in the end. So I'm going to go over to the machine and just show you my little technique for sewing the lines of stitching. Just before we do go over to the machine, one last thing is to think about the direction of the stitching that you're going to do. And what you tend to find is that the stitching looks better when it's worked across your sweet wrapper rather than up and down your sweet wrapper. So they're going to be free-flowing lines of stitching unless you want them to be exactly parallel, and they're going to go across the sweet wrapper rather than up and down the sweet wrapper. Okay, so in order to do this the simplest way and without wasting lots and lots of threads, we're going to do little U-turns at the end of each of our lines of stitching. So I've done some lines already on this sweet wrapper in front of us, and I'm just going to show you how I do the U-turns. So having stitched down one side, I'm going to run all the way to the other end of the wrapper and run off the wrapper into the Lamifix that is sitting at the ends. So I'll just finish this run off. And then with my needle down, I'm going to lift my presser foot, pivot my work, come round and sew about 4 stitches down. And then I'm going to pivot my work and run all the way back down the other end. Okay, so at the other end I'm pivoting, but I'm actually going to then pivot this way so that all of my project doesn't have to come through to the right hand side, and use my reverse button on my machine to go back 4 stitches. And then I'm going to pivot to come back down my work. So at all of the ends of my sweet wrapper I'm pivoting, but sometimes I'm pivoting and stitching forwards, and sometimes I'm pivoting and stitching backwards. And that's just in order to save having to get lots of work into the throat of my machine, and also to avoid having lots of loose threads to cut at the end. You could, if you wanted, just do your stitches each line individually, but this is just a way of saving thread. So when you've stitched both pieces of your sweet wrapper, you're then just going to trim them down to size and square them off. So I've just used a patchwork ruler and a rotary cutter for that, but you could draw on the back of them with a pen and use scissors. That would be absolutely fine. So I've now got 2 pieces that are going to be the outside for my pouch, and now I know the finished size of those, I can cut 2 pieces of fabric for the inside. So I've found some lovely purple fabric, and I've cut these to be approximately the same size as my sweet wrapper pouches. And I'm also going to need a zip, So I need a long zip. So I found a gold zip, and I'm going to put a gold zip across the top of my pouch. So when you've prepared your sweet wrapper and trimmed it to size, whatever that finish size is, you're going to need 2 pieces of lining fabric and a zip that is at least as long as your sweet wrapper pouch. Okay, so assembling this pouch is very similar to any other pouch. We're going to take our piece of lining fabric and we're going to pop our zip on top so that the edge of the zip is lined up with the top of the lining fabric. Now, because my zip is longer than I need it to be, I'm actually going to make my life easier and centre this piece of fabric in the length of the zip. I'll be trimming the zip off to size, and I'll make sure that the zip head comes down inside. So that's the centre, the lining fabric centred along the zip with the top of the lining fabric flush with the top of the zip. And then I'm going to take one part of my sweet wrapper pouch, make sure the text is going the right way up, and then I'm going to pop that down on top like so. Now, if you remember, I said about every stitch perforates the fabric. So if you have got pins, that's fine, but if you've got patchwork clips, even better, and then clip along where your zip is going to go. And then you won't be putting any unnecessary pin pricks into your sweet wrapper pouch. So I'm just going to clip my zip in place. So I'm just doing this by feel at the moment, trying to hold it all together. And then at the end, I always flip it over and just check that everything's still lined up. So at this end, I haven't caught the zip or the lining fabric. So just put that underneath there and put that underneath there. And right at the start here, that could be a tinsy bit better as well. So I'm just going to slide that zip right up to the top. Like so. So I'm just going to stitch down here now using the zipper foot on my sewing machine. If you want a more detailed explanation of how to put this zip in, do check out my zipped pouch tutorial. So I'm just going to go down there with my zipper foot now and stitch that in, and then I'll come back and we'll look at the other side of the zip. So there's one side of my zip in. And what I'm going to do next is just stitch down the lining fabric so that it doesn't get trapped in the underside of the zip. So this is a lovely second step if you want to do it. And what you're going to do is you're going to push the lining fabric away to the edge. And then this is the back of the zip. We're going to stitch just 1 millimetre or 2 away from this folded edge, just so that that lining fabric stays well away from the zip. On this one, it probably would anyway, because it's got a good level of clearance, but sometimes they can get trapped. So this is just a good final step when you're putting a zip in. Just stitch the lining away. If you're used to dressmaking, it's a bit like understitching when you go around a neckline or something similar. So I'll just go and do that. So my understitching is in place. So I'm now going to fold this away from the zip. I'm just going to run my fingers down there at this stage. It's tricky to iron everything because of the plastic, but it does fold quite nicely out of the way like so. And then I'm just going to repeat that process with the other side of the zip. So lining fabric down on the table first, and then zipped up to meet it. And then what you're looking to match now are these side edges over here. So just make sure that your top layer is exactly over your bottom layer. So I'm just going to slide mine to the left ever so slightly. So like that. And then your back of your pouch with the writing the right way up goes on top like so. And I'm just going to clip that in place, and then I'll stitch that in place as well. So our zip is in, and we're now going to open our zip up so that the zip is within the body of the pouch. And then we're going to bring, oh, just to check, I did also do the understitching on the other side. So we're now going to bring the right sides of our projects together. So that's the right side of the pouch and the right side of the lining. So again, ideally you want to be clipping this if you can rather than pinning it. But if you are pinning, just try and pin within the seam allowance that you're using, and then any of those pin prick holes won't necessarily get seen. So we're just going to pin or clip all the way around. I'll show you what to do with the zip in a minute. And I'm going to use a centimetre seam allowance around this now. You don't want the seam allowance to be too little because, again, things can rip. So I'm going to use a centimetre seam allowance all the way around. And that's the nice thing about adding the fabric to the back of the sweet wrapper, is that it just gives it a little bit more structure, so you're not so exposed to it completely ripping. Okay. So I've left a gap here between these ones, and that's my opening for turning through. So I'm not going to stitch between there, but I will be stitching all around the perimeter of my pouch. When it comes to the zip, so you're going to want the zip to be folded on itself, and your machine will stitch over it quite happily. And because it's the zip, I'm just going to put a pin through. So I know what I've said about extra pins, and that's just to keep the ridge of the zip just on the edge there. And on the other end, where it's completely open, just make sure that your two bits of zip ridge are lining up, and pop a pin in there as well. So you can see just in there, the two bits of my zip ridge are lining up nice and neatly. And that's really important to give a good finish at the end of the project. So now I'm going to stitch all the way around my pouch, but I'm going to sew each side as a separate seam. So I'll sew along the top edge, and then I'll stop and take it out of the machine and sew down the side edge. And that will give me crossing seams in the corners, which are going to make my pouch a lot stronger and a lot more durable. If you just pivot in the corners, it's a point of weakness. So I'll just do a bit here from that clip up to the corner, across the top and down and all the way around until I reach my other clip, which is the result, the marker for my opening. I'm using a centimetre seam allowance as I go round, and I will just sew at a slightly slower speed when it comes to going over the zip, just so that I don't put my machine under too much pressure, but it will happily sew over a plastic coil zip. Okay, let me go and do that and then I'll come back. So we've sewn all the way around. Remember to leave your opening on the lining, and it's quite worthwhile just to have a slightly bigger opening this time because this is a bit tougher to pull through, so normal rules apply. If it's quite stiff, just leave a slightly bigger opening. I'm now going to trim off the ends of my zip. Some people also like to reinforce by going backwards and forwards where the zip is. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Can make a difference just depending on how good the lineup is. And then my trick for turning through, let's get rid of those threads there that I don't need, is before I turn through, I'm just going to press back that seam allowance, just finger press it in place, and it will just make it a little bit easier for stitching together when we get to the final stage. So finger pressing is normally enough, but you could get your iron onto it if you wanted to. And if I just hold that up, you can see that we've now got a nice crisp folded edge that we will be able to stitch together. So it's turn through time. I will trim a little bit off in the bottom corners, but I'm not going to go really close. So just like that. That's just like you normally would do on anything that's a bit chunky. Just help ease it through. I'm not going to worry on my lining because it's not so thick. I'm going to put my hand down inside and I'm going to open up the zip all the way just to make life easier. And then I'm just going to scrunch that sweet wrapper into my hand, and then my hand can come through and the lining can go through the other way. Now you do need to be really careful when you're pushing through the sweet wrapper, because you could at this stage rip the plastic. Sometimes you'll notice at this stage that the vinyl comes away slightly from what it was attached to, where you're just doing lots of creasing to it, but a quick press again after and it reattaches quite nicely. So I'm just going to try and get the corners through. Just go really gently because too much pressure at this stage and you will rip your sweet wrapper. So just put my hand inside and push out that bottom seam. Those corners have come through quite nicely. I'm not going to push those anymore because they're slightly rounded, and that's the best we're going to get with the sweet wrapper. Okay, before I turn through all of the top, I'm just going to sew the hole together in my lining. And I find it easiest if I push out the bottom corners so I can get that bottom edge nice and flat. Put back in the fold that I'd pressed in, so it's sitting nice like that, and then I'm just going to stitch along that on the bottom edge. So my lining is all stitched up. Now I'm going to gently push out this top corner here, push the lining down inside. Sometimes it can be a good idea to make your lining ever so slightly smaller than your pouch, and then all of the pressure from the whatever's inside it is taken by the lining rather than the pouch. Now you'll see here that where the outside is quite a rigid form, it's still sticking up on the inside. So even if you do the understitching, you're still going to have to do a fair amount of finger pressing at this stage to get that inside edge just to sit down nicely. But it doesn't take long, and it doesn't take much use for it to work into place. And there we have one sweet wrapper pouch. So it's as simple as that. The trick is to get the iron-on vinyl just to make it that little bit stronger, and you might be able to pick up here that it's just come away ever so slightly from the purple. So the purple's darker here than it is here. So the vinyl's come away, so I can just give that another gentle press with a warm iron, and that will reattach. If you should end up with any splits along anywhere that you've stitched when you turn through, if you're a little bit tougher than I am, you can put very neatly cut sellotape across it, and because the whole thing is shiny anyway, you don't notice the sellotape's there, and it does act as a good sort of bandage barrier, if you like, for the bits that might have ripped apart. But there you go, one sweet wrapper pouch. I hope you've liked that tutorial. If you have, we always like to see what you've been up to, so do feel free to tag us on social media. We are at Made of Making on Facebook and Instagram. Have fun!